So I went and asked a friend of mine who is very much involved in the business of oil and gas, and I said, okay, I would like to invite somebody who has a very broad overview of where the field is, both practical as well as conceptual. Who would that be? And immediately the name that came was Professor Giacomo Luciani from Graduate Institute. Most people don't know that Geneva is the world center for oil and gas trading. And Professor Luciani is a professor, or adjunct professor there, and has been leading a master's in international energy program there, as well as in Paris School of International Affairs. This was established in Paris in 2011. He is adjunct professor of interdisciplinary studies at Graduate Institute. In 2010 to 2013, he was Princeton Global Scholar at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He has been involved in both advising and teaching, and in 2015, he launched a massive open online course, a MOOC, entitled Politics and Economics of International Energy. Over 4,000 students have gone through it, so very nice. And it's been running it for 23,000 students have been involved in it. So a lot of ears and eyes have been listening to you. And today we have a pleasure of being a group of us to listen to you on your thoughts about particularly natural gas. Professor Luciani.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. And what I thought I would be doing this morning is to give a broad overview of what we may expect for the future of gas in the transition, in the energy transition over the next couple of decades. In doing so, I will make extensive use of slides from the International Energy Agency, the latest World Energy Outlook. I think the International Energy Agency, we may say, is the reference of mainstream view. You may agree or disagree, but everybody in the end ends up referring to what the agency says. And it is certainly the broadest consultation process because it's the scenarios of the agency are not established purely on the basis of in-house work, but they reflect a very broad consultation of industry, governments, and so on. Now, in all scenarios, as you know, we have a variety, a multitude really keeps growing of scenarios from different sources. But there are certain regularities in these scenarios. And one of these regularities is that all scenarios that are based on a forecasting technique that are established on the basis of an analysis of today's situation, of what governments are actually doing, of what the industry is actually doing, not about some aspiration about the future. All these scenarios converge on 2 points. And the first point is that gas, natural gas, is going to play a growing role. So in a context in which energy consumption increases, the relative proportions of the different primary sources change, and the relative importance of natural gas grows. And the second point is that within the total global gas supply, the role of LNG is also going to increase. So these 2 points are I would say, points of convergence in the opinion. Specifically, the agency believes that the role of renewables and gas is going to grow quite rapidly. In the case of gas, it is for industry, power, and other users, so pretty much across the entire spectrum of users, energy users. And that is different from what we expect for oil or coal, where there is a balance between an expected increase in developing economies and a decrease in the advanced economies. But for gas, the increase is everywhere, including in the advanced economies. There are some differences in between the three scenarios that the agency proposes. The consumption of gas is expected to increase both in the new policies and in the current policies. It is expected to decrease in the Sustainable Development Goals scenario. But, you know, people have to be clear about the meaning of these scenarios. The Sustainable Goals Development Goals scenario is a backcasting scenario. It's one in which, you know, you have determined the outcome. You want to assume that by 2040 we will be in line with the expectations of the Paris Agreement and other sustainable goals, objectives of the United Nations. And you ask yourself what needs to be done in order to achieve those targets. It is not what is happening. In fact, the gap in between scenarios that are based on an analysis of current situations, such as the new policies, which assumes that all promises that have been made by governments will be respected, and we know that normally governments do not always respect all the promises that they formulate, all the engagements that they formulate, and the current policies, which is based on what is today the situation. You know, this gap is bound to increase because as we keep on not doing what would need to be done, you know, the gap between aspirations and reality is bound to increase. So the Sustainable Development scenario is a useful reference, but it is not something that is realistic in any sense. It's what would need to be done, but it's not being done at the moment. Gas demand will especially be significant and growing, rapidly growing in China. China, by the end of the period 2040, is expected to have a total consumption of gas which is equal to that of the entire European Union. Not surprising given the size of China's population, but you know, certainly causing a significant rebalancing of international trade in natural gas, because today the European Union dominates international trade in natural gas, and in the future this is not going to be the case. Interestingly, in the case of China, we will see this also in another subsequent slide. The driver of gas consumption is not primarily power. Power is one of the components, but you have lots of increasing demand in industry and in buildings. So Chinese gas demand has a broad spectrum of uses in the context of Chinese effort for increasing the role of renewables and also investing massively in nuclear for power generation. You can see that gas is just one of the alternatives that they are pursuing. And they still remain substantially beholden to coal, which is a major problem. So natural gas imports in different parts of the world, you can see that this is for the European Union. You can see that the agency expects that imports of natural gas in Europe might peak in 2025, very slightly decline by 2030, more significantly decline by 2040. This is one of the points of uncertainty because different scenarios diverge on this, on European gas demand. It very much depends on what we assume about the future use of coal in the European Union. I'm sure you are aware of the difficulties that are being experienced by the Commission for exiting coal that has been established in Germany, that has kept postponing the day in which they will announce a conclusion because they cannot agree on a conclusion. And now Frau Merkel has been personally called to intervene and mediate, but you know, it's not at all clear what kind of rabbit she will be able to fish out of the hat. And it's a very controversial thing. In my opinion, the fast elimination of coal from power generation is the single most important and effective thing we can do to abate emissions. So it should be done much more forcefully, and that would translate in an increase in the demand for gas, especially if we assume that all the countries that have announced that they are exiting nuclear will actually exit nuclear, about which I am not 100% sure. But, you know, Germany will exit nuclear. But everybody else who has been saying that they will exit nuclear, Sweden, this country, and, and other countries, may very well have second thoughts. But, you know, if they do what they are saying, then certainly their dependence on gas will increase. As you can see, the proportions of pipeline versus LNG gas will also change. LNG is today not very important for Europe, but it will become increasingly important. And the dependence, especially from the point of view of security, the specific dependence on pipeline gas from Russia will decrease, although it will remain as the most important component of the total. One consequence of the growing role of LNG is that we are looking to a fundamental unification of the global gas market, which today does not exist. So price differentials in between different regions will be closed, with the exception of the United States, because the United States is a sending country, is an exporting country, and they, in terms of domestic price, will enjoy the fact that they don't need to liquefy gas. So the difference there is the cost of liquefaction and transportation. The role of gas increases in all countries, and this is interesting. It is with respect to LNG, who will be the major importers and who will be the major exporters. And here you can see that although imports of LNG in the European Union do increase quite significantly, LNG is going to be, as it is today, primarily an Asian affair. Most of the LNG is expected to end up in Asia and in China, of course, but not only China. And in terms of exports, it's quite diversified, with the Middle East remaining perhaps the single most important sending region, followed by Australia. You know that there is a kind of competition between Qatar and Australia as with respect to being the number one LNG exporter, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, and the United States. The expectation is that the United States will be a major LNG exporting country. This is about Asian LNG imports, and you can see that their share in global LNG trade is going to increase, accounting for more than 60% of total LNG trade. So when we speak of LNG and financial conditions, political conditions for the LNG development, it's about the Far East that we need to, and South Asia that we need to discuss. As I said, power is not the most important sector of utilization for gas in China. That is different in other parts of Asia. It is the most important driver for gas demand in Southeast Asia, in Pakistan and Bangladesh. In India, the most important driver for gas demand is industry. So you have these differences which are important because depending on the sector of utilization, the characteristics of demand, the sensitivity to prices, the kind of specifics that you are looking for in terms of supply, and the pattern of supplies over time is different. So the composition of LNG imports is expected to be very much flexible. So the proportion of total LNG imports that are based on a short-term flexible contract will be quite significant, and that is very important in terms of market realities, and it's different from what we see still in Europe. This is perhaps the most important and interesting slide. It tells us that in terms of exports towards Europe, we expect a decline in pipeline exports from Russia, and we expect an increase in pipeline exports from the Middle East. We expect an increase in LNG exports from the Middle East and from Africa and from the United States. And, you know, there is an expectation that there will be a pipeline from the Caspian, which is something that has been in discussion for such a long time. Exports to Asia are primarily LNG, as we said already, from all sources, except from the Caspian, and to some extent Chinese imports from Russia that are by pipeline. So the demand for gas in the European Union is, as I mentioned already, declining in the opinion of the International Energy Agency. I said that I have some reservations about this, and it depends on assumptions about power generation. This is interesting because in the case of gas, the seasonal variations in demand are very important. And we see that there is an expectation that these seasonal variations in Europe will decline. The importance of this seasonal variation will decline, and primarily because of increased efficiency in buildings. And that is something that, again, you know, you may raise a question mark about the assumption because improving efficiency in building, everybody has been saying that this is the low-hanging fruit, but no one is picking this fruit. I mean, it's not happening, and it's extremely difficult to achieve. That's my last slide, and it tells you the utilization, the degree of utilization of existing capacity, transmission capacity for gas, both LNG import capacity and pipeline import capacity, and transmission capacity within the European Union. What this tells us is that the agency believes that there is substantial redundant capacity, and that is something that would allow down the road easier redirection of flows within the European Union market in case of emergencies of any sort, okay? As you might know, especially when we speak about LNG, there is a debate due to the fact that we have very substantial non-utilized regasification capacity, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, and there is a lack of capacity towards the east. And some people argue that we should be increasing the transmission capacity within the continent, within Europe, rather than building new regasification plants. In the end, both things will happen, but what is interesting is that the new development of new pipelines, thanks to the action of the European Commission, and especially introduction of reverse flow capacity in the pipelines within the continent, has been gaining a lot, and that has indeed meant that we have greater flexibility in redirecting gas flows within the continent, depending on circumstances. That's the situation that represents our major expectations, and I think it's the backdrop that we may keep in mind in the discussion about the future role of gas and LNG in particular.
Very good. Thank you very much. There's time for maybe a couple of questions to Professor Luciani.
Yes. Okay, the cost, there are different things to be kept in mind. In the case of pipeline gas, an essential determinant of the cost is the size and the length of the pipe. So it depends how long you have to transport it. It depends how large can be the pipe. If you have a very large pipe, the cost comes down. And if you have a very long pipe, the cost goes up. Another key determinant is whether the pipe exists or you have to build it. Okay, so that's in the case of Russia, there is plenty of pipe in existence. They still want to build new ones, such as Nord Stream 2. It's not clear that this might be a sensible proposition from a purely commercial point of view. They say it is a sensible proposition because it's considerably shorter than the existing, to reach the German market, than the existing infrastructure. So the answer is not very easy. In the case of LNG, it depends on the cost of construction of the liquefaction plant. And historically, the cost of construction of liquefaction plants has been fluctuating. We have cases in which it has been, companies have been able to establish liquefaction capacity very cheaply, and other cases in which it has cost an arm and a leg. So it's not easy to answer that. But, what most people say is that once you have the capacity, the cost of investment is sunk. So what you need to recover on any one shipment is purely the direct cost. So this is how US LNG is entering the European market today. It's entering at a loss if you consider the entire cost, including the cost of establishing the liquefaction capacity. But because you have established it, you have it, so you know, you might as well use it. And, and that's how they can sell LNG to Europe. Certainly, Europe will remain the most difficult market for US LNG because the competition from Russia is intense, and the Russians have made it clear that they intend to compete. So they will be flexible on price in order to maintain market share.
We will come back to that point.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes.
So let's say looking forward, let's say to 2030, do you think it's going to stay that way, or is there really going to be like a day trading, if you will?
Well, I think there will always be some LNG which is based on long-term contracts. Not because some of the customers like the security which is provided by a long-term contract. Asian customers, you know, they like the flexibility in price, but they will be highly dependent on these shipments. So I don't think they would be happy if the share of flexible supplies, as we have seen, was really excessive, okay? No. But what we know for sure is that LNG that is being developed by major international oil companies, the Shells, the Exxons of this world, and also LNG from the United States is going to be available on a flexible basis. In the case of the United States, this depends on the fact that the gas resource is being developed anyhow. And so you're not looking at an integrated project. The company does not need to decide about you know, developing the resource, establishing LNG, finding a market for it. You know, they just decide about establishing an LNG capacity, and this is done on a commercial basis. We know the model of Cheniere. Now will, you know, the new model that is being pursued by Tellurian. You know, this is very flexible, and for sure it will create a share of total LNG trade which is flexible and available for short-term trading. You know, the traders in Geneva are entering the LNG field quite aggressively. So they sense, they know, they have concluded that this is an area where they can make good money.
Well, there's slow convergence happening, but let's move on to the panel for the sake of time. There will be time for questions and answers. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.